Blood dripped from a boy's hand onto frozen dirt, and 4 men in dark cloaks closed in around him with swords drawn. He was 17 years old. He was a prince, and in a few seconds he was going to die. He staggered backward, one arm hanging useless at his side. His breathing came in short, ragged pulls. The tallest of the assassins spoke first, calling him nothing more than a stray dog wearing royal silk. The words landed harder than any blade so far. He had heard versions of that insult since he could remember, whispered by servants, sneered by nobles, even mouthed silently by his own relatives. This time, it came paired with a raised sword. He lunged sideways, barely dodging a strike meant for his throat. Pain exploded through his ribs where an earlier blow had already cracked bone. His vision blurred at the edges. Somewhere behind that pain, a small, stubborn part of his mind kept counting seconds, kept searching for a gap, kept refusing to accept that this was how his story ended, in a nameless field, killed by men he would never even learn the names of. To understand how a 17-year-old prince ended up alone and dying in the dirt, the story had to go back further, back to a boy who was never supposed to matter at all. He was born the 7th son of the cult lord, ruler of one of the most feared martial powers in the land. In most families, being a prince meant privilege. In his family, it meant a target. His mother had never been a proper wife. She had been a servant who caught the Lord's eye for one season, then was discarded the moment she gave birth. From his very first breath, half the court treated him as an embarrassment rather than an heir. The 6 great clans ran the true machinery of power behind the cult lord's throne. Each clan groomed its own candidate for succession, arranged marriages to strengthen bloodlines, and quietly eliminated anything that threatened the balance they had built over generations. A 7th prince with no clan backing him, born to a woman with no standing, was exactly that kind of threat. Not because he was strong, because his blood alone gave him a claim, however small, to something they all wanted for themselves. So they made sure he stayed weak. Tutors assigned to teach him martial arts were quietly reassigned elsewhere. Cultivation manuals meant for royal children never reached his room. Medicine that should have strengthened his body during childhood illnesses arrived late or not at all. By the time he was old enough to understand what was happening to him, the damage was already permanent. He had almost no internal energy, no real training, no one of consequence standing behind him. His mother had understood the danger long before he did. She tried to protect him in the only ways left to her, teaching him to read danger in a room before anyone spoke a word, teaching him which servants could be trusted and which ones reported everything back to the clans. Then, one winter, she grew sick with a fever that no physician could explain. Within weeks, she was gone. He never received a clear answer about what killed her. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, rumors of poison followed him for years afterward, rumors nobody bothered to investigate, because nobody with power cared enough to ask. He remembered standing beside her bed as her breathing slowed, remembered the empty hallway outside her room, remembered that his father never came, not once, not even at the end. That absence taught him more about his place in the family than any insult ever could. The years after her death blurred into a long, gray stretch of survival. He learned to expect nothing from anyone wearing his father's colors. He learned to eat food only after someone else had tasted it first. He learned which corridors to avoid at night. The only steady warmth in his life came from an old guard named Jang, a broad, quiet man who had served his mother and, after her death, quietly appointed himself the boy's protector without ever being asked. Guard Jang taught him small things that added up to survival. How to fall without breaking bones. How to read the mood of a room before entering it. How to disappear into a crowd when danger walked past. He never spoke of the Lord with anger, but he also never made excuses for him. In a household built entirely on political calculation, Jang's loyalty was the one thing that came free. By the time the boy turned 17, an invitation arrived that reshaped the rest of his life, though not for the reason anyone expected. The demonic academy opened its gates only once every 10 years. Every noble family, every clan, every faction inside the cult sent their most promising children to compete for a place inside its walls. 4 years of training awaited those who survived the entrance trials. 4 years that could turn a mediocre fighter into a genuine power, and turn a genuine talent into a legend. Every seat inside that academy was a seat at the table of the future. The 7th prince was, technically, eligible to attend. In practice, everyone assumed he would either be quietly excluded or would embarrass himself so badly in the entrance trials that his failure would end any remaining questions about his bloodline's worth. Either outcome suited the 6 great clans perfectly. He knew all of this walking toward the academy gates on the morning of the ceremony. He knew it in the way his entrance badge had mysteriously gone missing the night before, forcing him to arrive later than every other candidate. He knew it in the way officials moved slower whenever they had to deal with his paperwork, dragging their feet just enough to make him wait, just enough to make a point without ever technically breaking a rule. By the time he reached the courtyard, the other candidates were already assembled in neat rows according to clan and rank. The heirs of the 6 great clans stood at the very front, dressed in fine ceremonial robes, surrounded by servants who had clearly spent hours preparing them for this single morning. Whispers followed him as he crossed the courtyard alone. No servants, no procession, no one to announce his arrival. Then the cult lord entered. Every candidate dropped into a formal bow. The 7th prince bowed as well, lower than most, out of habit rather than respect. When he lifted his head, he caught his father's eyes for exactly 1 heartbeat. Nothing about that gaze warmed for a single second. Then the lord's attention slid past him entirely, moving on to greet the heir of the strongest clan with something that almost resembled warmth. That was the moment, more than any insult from a rival, more than any whispered rumor about his mother, that confirmed everything he already suspected. He would receive nothing from his own father. Whatever future he built, he would have to build entirely on his own. The Academy's presiding elders wasted no time on speeches. A woman known simply as the Sound Elder stepped forward to explain the first trial, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard without any visible effort. She explained that the first stage of selection would test the body's resilience rather than any learned skill. A pulse of concentrated sound energy would strike every candidate at once. Those whose bodies could not withstand it would collapse, and collapse meant elimination from the academy entirely. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Several candidates from lesser families exchanged nervous glances. Even a few of the clan heirs shifted their weight, unconsciously bracing for what was coming. The 7th prince stood still, mostly because he had nothing left to lose by standing still, and partly because some old habit from years of hiding his reactions kept his face carefully blank. The Sound Elder raised one hand. The pulse hit before anyone could brace properly. It struck not like a physical blow, but like the world itself had suddenly turned against every ear in the courtyard. Candidates dropped in waves. Some clutched their heads and screamed. Blood ran from more than one set of ears within seconds. Even several of the strongest heirs staggered, gritting their teeth, forcing themselves to remain upright through sheer stubbornness. The 7th prince felt nothing, not silence exactly. He heard the sound clearly enough, felt the pressure of it wash over his skin like heat from a distant fire. But the damage that should have followed simply never arrived. His ears did not ring, his skull did not throb. He remained standing in the middle of a courtyard filled with collapsing bodies, and for several long seconds, he had absolutely no idea why. He would learn the answer only later, and the answer traced back exactly 1 week, to a night he had nearly died in a very different way. 1 week earlier, 4 assassins had cornered him on a forest road far from any city walls, hired by enemies who wanted the 7th prince eliminated before he ever set foot inside the academy. He had fought back with whatever crude fighting he had scraped together over the years, enough to delay his death but never enough to prevent it. By the time the 4th blade found its mark, he was already bleeding out onto frozen ground, certain that his story was ending exactly where his enemies had always wanted it to end. That was when a stranger appeared. The man wore clothing unlike anything from this world, fabric too smooth, cut too strange, colors too clean for a forest road stained with blood. He moved through the 4 assassins with almost lazy efficiency, disarming and dropping each one before they fully understood what was happening. Then he knelt beside the dying prince, said something the boy was too far gone to fully process, and pressed something impossibly small against his skin. The last thing the prince remembered before darkness took him was a strange, cool sensation spreading beneath his skin, as if thousands of tiny currents were moving through his blood at once. He woke up alive. That alone should have been impossible. A quiet voice greeted him the moment his eyes opened, a voice that existed only inside his own head. It introduced itself as Nano, explaining in calm, precise terms that it consisted of hundreds of millions of microscopic machines now integrated into his body. It could analyze his physical condition. It could accelerate healing. It could study martial arts through direct observation and adapt his muscles to match techniques far faster than any normal cultivation method allowed. At first, he assumed the pain and blood loss had finally broken his mind. Then Nano demonstrated exactly what it could do, repairing torn muscle fiber in his arm within minutes, something that should have taken weeks of proper treatment. He watched the wound close in real time, watched color return to skin that had been ash-gray moments before, and understood, slowly and with a kind of disbelief that refused to fully settle, that everything about his life had just changed. Nano explained its limitations honestly. It could not leave his body. It could not heal anyone but him. Major modifications took time, and often came with real pain. But within those limits, it offered him something no cultivation manual, no clan backing, no royal favor had ever given him. A path forward that belonged entirely to himself. He kept Nano's existence secret from the very first day, revealing a mysterious power to a court built on political calculation would only mark him for a faster, more determined kind of assassination attempt. So when Nano silenced the effects of the Sound Elder's attack during the Academy trial, he understood immediately what he had to do next. He could not simply remain standing while every other candidate collapsed around him. That kind of miracle invited exactly the wrong kind of attention. Quietly, deliberately, he asked Nano to simulate the damage he should have taken. A moment later, he staggered, clutched his ears, and let blood trickle from the corner of his mouth before collapsing onto the stone courtyard along with everyone else. It was, in its own strange way, the first deliberate performance of his new life, convincing an entire academy that he had barely survived something he had walked through without a scratch. The Sound Elder noticed him remain upright longer than almost anyone else in the courtyard, and something about that irritated her more than she expected. She increased the intensity of the pulse twice more before finally lowering her hand, unaware that her growing frustration had nearly killed half the candidates gathered before her, elites and nobodies alike, indiscriminately. When the elders moved through the fallen bodies afterward, checking each candidate for injuries and internal energy levels, they reached the seventh prince last. Someone checked his pulse first, then his internal energy, and the number that came back made even the presiding instructor pause. 0. No measurable internal energy at all, and yet he had remained conscious through nearly the entire pulse before his careful, staged collapse. Whispers spread fast after that. Some candidates assumed pure luck. Others assumed hidden talent finally surfacing after years of suppression. A few instructors exchanged glances that suggested something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind reserved for a mystery rather than a joke. Nobody in that courtyard came anywhere close to the actual truth. He was carried to the academy infirmary along with the other injured candidates, his staged wounds convincing enough that the healers treating him never questioned why his recovery, once it began, moved far faster than anyone expected. Beneath the bandages and the concerned expressions of the medical staff, Nano worked quietly through the night, repairing damage that had never actually existed while the rest of his body slowly, genuinely strengthened in ways no one around him could see. Lying in that infirmary bed, listening to the quiet breathing of injured strangers around him, the seventh prince allowed himself a small and careful kind of hope, the first he had felt in years. Not because anyone had finally chosen to help him, not because his father had suddenly noticed him, because somewhere inside his own body, something extraordinary now existed that belonged to no one but him, and nobody, not the 6 great clans, not the rival heirs, not even the cult lord himself, had any idea it was there. He returned to the training grounds on a gray morning, and the first thing he noticed was how little anyone bothered to look at him. Cadets moved through their assigned formations in loose clusters, sorted roughly by clan affiliation and rank. A few glanced his way out of habit, registered nothing worth their attention, and returned to their own drills. As far as most of them were concerned, the seventh prince nobody respected had spent 2 weeks recovering from a beating the Sound Elder's trial had handed him, and would need weeks more before catching up to anyone who mattered. The instructor running that morning's session called out the day's formation, a basic energy circulation pattern meant to synchronize breathing with footwork. Most new cadets stumbled through it clumsily for their first several sessions, tripping over the transitions between stances. The prince moved through it without a single wasted motion. His feet found each position exactly where the pattern demanded. His breathing matched the required rhythm on the very first pass. A few nearby cadets slowed mid-stride to watch. confused by what they were seeing from someone who supposedly held zero internal energy only weeks earlier. The instructor noticed too. He said nothing in the moment, but his eyes lingered on the prince a beat longer than they lingered on anyone else that morning. Word spread quietly among the rival heirs by midday. Someone mentioned that the weak prince had returned looking sharper than expected. Someone else dismissed it as luck, or perhaps a fluke born from watching others train during his recovery. Beneath the dismissals, a thread of suspicion had already begun to form, the kind that would only grow harder to ignore with time. One of the clan heirs decided to test that suspicion directly. During a sparring drill disguised as routine formation practice, a cadet from a mid-tier clan maneuvered himself into position beside the prince, waiting for the instructor's attention to drift elsewhere. When the moment came, he drove an elbow toward the prince's ribs, with far more force than any formation exercise required, aiming to disguise a genuine injury as an unfortunate training accident. Nano intercepted the strike before it landed with any real damage, redirecting the prince's stance just enough to absorb the blow harmlessly across muscle rather than bone. What should have cracked a rib instead barely bruised him. The attacking cadet, thrown off balance by his own miscalculated force, stumbled forward awkwardly in front of the entire formation. The instructor turned just in time to catch the tail end of it, assumed correctly that the strike had been deliberate, and pulled the offending cadet aside for a sharp public reprimand. Several nearby students exchanged glances, quietly recalculating exactly how harmless the seventh prince actually was. That recalculation accelerated 3 days later, in front of a much larger audience. The heir of the Spring Clan, a young man known for a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of his own importance, cornered the prince near the edge of the training yard during a break between drills. A small crowd of onlookers gathered instinctively, drawn by the promise of confrontation the way crowds always were. The Spring heir opened with an insult crude enough to draw scattered laughter from his own followers, calling the prince a stray born from a servant's bed, unworthy of the royal name he carried. It was a familiar wound, one the prince had absorbed countless times throughout his life. This time, though, he had an audience large enough to matter. He answered calmly, his tone flat and unhurried. He pointed out that insulting his blood meant insulting the very bloodline the Spring heir claimed to serve so faithfully, since, like it or not, that same royal blood ran through both their veins by the Lord's own decree. The insult landed with far more weight than the Spring heir expected. Laughter among the onlookers faltered, replaced by uncertain murmuring. Unable to reclaim the moment with words, the Spring heir did what wounded pride usually demanded. He swung first. The blow came fast, trained, backed by years of proper clan instruction the prince had never received. Nano flagged the strike's trajectory instantly, but raw technique alone wasn't enough to counter someone genuinely skilled. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, Nano searched through its accumulated combat data and found no martial arts response fast enough to match the situation. What it offered instead was boxing. The prince's fists snapped up in an unfamiliar guard, elbows tucked, weight shifted onto the balls of his feet in a stance that belonged to no martial tradition anyone in that yard had ever studied. He ducked beneath the Spring heir's follow-up strike and countered with a short, compact punch that connected solidly against the heir's jaw. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Even the prince himself felt a flicker of surprise at his own body moving through a rhythm he'd never consciously learned. Nano explained quietly, in the silent space of his mind, that without a suitable martial style already cataloged for this exact exchange, it had drawn from a different combat discipline entirely, one built around speed and economy of motion rather than traditional forms. The exchange continued for several more heated seconds, and gradually, Nano began weaving fragments of actual martial technique back into the sequence as it analyzed the Spring heir's fighting patterns in real motion. What started as a borrowed foreign stance shifted, blow by blow, into a rough approximation of proper martial arts, refined and adjusted on the fly. The Spring heir, visibly rattled by an opponent who fought like no one he'd trained against, began making small mistakes born from frustration rather than skill. The prince capitalized on each one, and within another minute, the heir found himself flat on his back in the dirt, blood trickling from a split lip, the crowd around them utterly silent. Nobody laughed this time. The prince offered no gloating words, no dramatic speech. He simply straightened his robes and walked away, leaving the Spring heir to climb back to his feet in front of an audience that would remember this moment far longer than any formal lesson taught that week. Later, Quiet whispers among a few sympathetic instructors revealed something about the spring heir few students knew. His sharp tongue and desperate need to prove himself traced back to a childhood spent under a father who accepted nothing less than perfection, punishing failure harshly and rewarding success with little more than cold indifference. It explained the boy's cruelty without excusing it, a small, human crack beneath an otherwise unlikable exterior. News of the fight moved through the academy faster than any official announcement could have managed. By the following morning, cadets who had barely acknowledged the seventh prince's existence now watched him differently. Some with cautious respect, others with the wary distance reserved for something newly recognized as dangerous. One unexpected result of that shift arrived quietly, without fanfare. The cadet who had once tried to assassinate him in the infirmary sought him out privately, kneeling without being asked, offering loyalty in place of the death sentence he clearly believed he still deserved. He had watched the spring heir's defeat and drawn his own conclusions about which side of the academy's shifting power balance he wanted to stand on. The prince considered the offer carefully. Trust, once broken, rarely rebuilt itself cleanly. But a frightened, indebted informant with intimate knowledge of who had originally hired him carried real value, provided he was watched closely enough to prevent a second betrayal. The prince accepted, cautiously, keeping the arrangement as quiet as everything else he'd built since arriving. That evening, curiosity finally got the better of him. He asked Nano directly just how much more it was capable of, beyond healing and combat assistance and the occasional strange borrowed fighting style. The answer surprised him more than he expected. Nano possessed functions it had never fully disclosed, restricted until certain conditions were met, certain thresholds crossed. It began transferring additional information directly into the prince's understanding, entire categories of knowledge he hadn't known existed within his own body. Foreign languages appeared in his mind fully formed, an entire vocabulary belonging to a world centuries removed from his own. System functions he'd never accessed unlocked one after another, revealing capabilities Nano had been quietly holding in reserve. Among the new functions was something Nano called Augmented Reality Combat Simulation, a way of generating fully realistic training opponents inside the prince's own perception, without requiring any physical partner at all. Nano explained immediately how the function worked. It could construct a fully rendered opponent inside the prince's perception, built entirely from observed movement, drawing on every motion it had already recorded during the fight with the spring heir. The opponent would react, adapt, and fight back exactly as the real person would, all without a single physical body standing in the training yard. That night, alone in a quiet corner of the barracks after the other cadets had gone to sleep, the prince closed his eyes and asked Nano to begin. The world around him didn't change. Not exactly. He still felt the cool stone floor beneath him, still heard the distant creak of the building settling. But layered over that reality, a second presence sharpened into focus. The spring heir standing across from him in a fighting stance, expression twisted with the same wounded arrogance he'd worn during their real confrontation. The simulated version came in fast. The prince reacted instinctively, drawing on the fragments of borrowed technique Nano had woven together during the real fight. It wasn't enough. The simulated spring heir slipped past his guard and landed a blow that never actually touched his body, but registered in his mind as pain sharp enough to make him flinch. He opened his eyes gasping, heart pounding, genuinely startled by how real the sensation had felt. Nano explained calmly that the simulation replicated combat stress accurately enough to train real reflexes, though it stopped short of causing lasting harm. Pain existed to teach, not to injure. He tried again. The second attempt lasted slightly longer before the simulated opponent found an opening and ended the exchange decisively. The third attempt lasted longer still, though the outcome remained the same. Somewhere around the fifth loss, frustration began creeping into his concentration, making his responses sloppier rather than sharper. Nano offered a quiet observation. Copying a technique and mastering it under pressure were two entirely different skills. The prince had absorbed the spring heir's fighting style visually, understood its mechanics intellectually, but real combat demanded instinct that no amount of borrowed knowledge could substitute for. That instinct only came from repetition, from losing enough times that the body itself began adjusting without conscious thought. It marked, in a small and unglamorous way, the first honest limit he'd encountered since receiving Nano. Everything else had come easily, almost unfairly so. This didn't. He kept going anyway. Loss 6 taught him to read the shift in his opponent's shoulders before a strike came. Loss 9 taught him that the simulated spring air favored his left side whenever pressured, a habit the real version had shown too during their brief fight. One nano hadn't flagged as significant until repeated failure made the pattern impossible to ignore. Loss 12 ended almost as quickly as the first, but this time he noticed exactly where his footwork had failed him, rather than simply feeling the pain and resetting. Somewhere past a dozen defeats, something in his approach began to shift. He stopped trying to perfectly recreate the exact sequence from that earlier street brawl and started responding instead to what the simulated opponent actually did in front of him. Small adjustments. A half step earlier. A guard held slightly lower to bait an opening, rather than simply defend against everything. Loss 17 came agonizingly close to something else entirely. For 3 full exchanges, he held his own, matching the simulated air blow for blow, before a single mistimed step let the simulation finish him off. He sat afterward in the dark barracks, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his sleeping robe despite none of it being physically real, and felt something close to genuine excitement rather than frustration. The next attempt, he won. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the effortless victory his earlier borrowed skills had provided against the real spring air. He took several solid hits along the way, made at least 2 mistakes that would have cost him badly against a real opponent with real consequences. But when the simulated spring air finally dropped to one knee, defeated on the prince's own merit rather than Nano's borrowed technique, something settled in his chest that felt entirely different from every other victory Nano had quietly engineered for him so far. Nano noted the outcome without particular ceremony, simply logging the win and asking whether he wished to continue training against increasingly difficult simulated opponents. The prince said yes without hesitation. Over the following nights, he built a private rhythm nobody else in the academy knew existed. By day, he trained openly among his classmates, careful never to reveal too much too quickly, still hiding behind the excuse of the guardian's private instruction whenever anyone asked how he'd improved so fast. By night, he fought increasingly difficult versions of opponents' Nano, generated from whatever combat data it had gathered, sharpening instincts that pure knowledge alone would never have given him. Guard Zhang noticed the exhaustion first. The old guard found him one morning during a rare, quiet moment between drills, dark circles shadowing his eyes, movements slightly slower than they should have been after supposedly restful nights. He asked directly what was keeping the boy awake so late, concern plain in his weathered face. The prince nearly told him the truth. Of everyone in his life, Zhang had earned that honesty more than anyone else, having stayed loyal through every year when loyalty offered him nothing but risk. But the habit of protecting people by keeping them ignorant of real danger ran deep, forged over years of watching his mother try to shield him the same way. He offered instead a half explanation about extra training with the Guardian, technically true even if it left out the stranger half of his nights entirely. Zhang didn't fully believe him. He said as much, quietly, without pressing further. He simply reminded the prince that exhaustion killed as effectively as any blade, and that whatever secret burden he carried, he didn't have to carry all of it alone. The prince thanked him and said nothing more, though the words settled somewhere deep enough to matter later. Dr. Bake, the academy physician who had overseen his supposed recovery weeks earlier, raised a different kind of question entirely. During a routine checkup required of all cadets who had suffered notable injuries during the entrance trials, Beck's fingers paused over the boy's ribs a moment longer than necessary. The scarring pattern beneath his skin didn't match what a normal healing injury should have left behind. It looked, if anything, like wounds that had healed twice as fast as medically possible, leaving faint traces that a careless observer might miss entirely. Beck said nothing accusatory. He simply noted the anomaly aloud, almost to himself, and watched the prince's face carefully for a reaction. The prince kept his expression neutral, offering the same worn explanation about stubborn recovery and a body that had simply learned to heal fast out of necessity. The doctor didn't push, not yet, but something in his expression suggested the explanation hadn't fully satisfied him. Unlike the suspicious clan heirs who wanted him dead, or the political rivals who wanted him controlled, Beck's curiosity seemed rooted in plain, uncomplicated concern. The kind of steady attention a physician keeps for a patient whose body keeps telling a story its owner refuses to share. The prince filed that encounter away carefully. Beck wasn't an enemy, but secrets survived only as long as the people around them chose not to look too closely, and the doctor was beginning to look very closely indeed. Meanwhile, the political undercurrents running through the academy grew steadily more dangerous. Word of his victory over the spring heir had reached beyond the training yard, traveling through servant gossip and cadet whispers until it eventually reached ears connected directly to the 6 great clans themselves. A weak, illegitimate prince embarrassing a clan heir in public wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a signal that the careful balance the clans had maintained for years might be shifting in ways nobody had planned for. Reports of increased scrutiny followed within days. Servants loyal to rival factions began paying closer attention to his movements. A courier delivering routine academy correspondence lingered a beat too long outside his quarters one evening, an act small enough to dismiss as coincidence, suspicious enough that the prince noted it carefully all the same. He mentioned the growing attention to the Guardian during one of their private sessions, watching the older man's reaction closely. The Guardian's expression sobered in a way that rarely happened, the usual half-drunk amusement fading into something more serious. He confirmed what the prince already suspected. The clans wouldn't move against him carelessly now, not after the incident with the hired assassin inside the infirmary had already failed once. But patience was not the same as surrender. They would wait for a better opportunity, a moment when his death could be explained away as misfortune rather than murder. The Guardian's warning settled uncomfortably alongside everything else weighing on the prince's mind. His mother's death remained unresolved. The identity of the strange visitor who had given him Nano remained a complete mystery. Someone from a world so far removed from this one that even Nano itself offered no clear answers about who had sent it or why. Every improvement in his own strength seemed to invite equally proportional danger from people determined to see him fail. And yet, alone at night, fighting increasingly skilled versions of opponents that existed only inside his own mind, he found something he hadn't expected to find inside the Academy's walls at all. Not comfort exactly, a clearer sense of purpose. A reason to keep pushing forward that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with becoming someone capable of protecting what little he had left. That calculated patience the Guardian warned about didn't take long to reveal its first shape. An official announcement went up across the academy grounds barely a week later, posted on the training hall's central board where every cadet would see it before morning drills began. The second examination had been set, scheduled far earlier in the academic calendar than tradition normally allowed. Officially, the early date reflected an unusually strong entering class that no longer required the full standard preparation period. Unofficially, several instructors muttered privately that someone with influence had pushed hard for the change. The prince read the notice standing among a cluster of other cadets and understood immediately what it actually meant. A rushed examination favored candidates who had trained under proper clan tutors since childhood. It punished anyone who needed time to catch up. Anyone whose progress depended on secret nighttime training rather than generations of inherited technique. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was a quiet, deniable attempt to strip away whatever advantage his recent improvement had bought him. He mentioned the suspicion to the Guardian that same evening, watching the older man's jaw tighten as he read through the announcement a second time. Clever, the Guardian admitted, though nothing about his tone suggested admiration. Nobody can prove a clan pushed for this. It simply happens to hurt you more than anyone else in this academy. He explained what the second examination would demand. Unlike the sound trial, which tested pure physical endurance, this stage measured actual combat skill directly against fellow cadets in ranked, one-on-one matches. Losing didn't mean elimination outright, but it meant public humiliation recorded permanently in academy records. Records that followed a cadet for the rest of their time inside those walls, shaping which resources, which mentors, which opportunities remained open to them afterward. For someone still building a reputation from nothing, an early public loss could undo months of careful progress in a single afternoon. The Guardian offered no easy comfort. He simply doubled the intensity of their private sessions, pushing the boy's cultivation forward at a pace that left him trembling with exhaustion most nights, forcing internal energy through pathways that ached for hours afterward. Whatever pain the process caused, Nano quietly managed the worst of it, keeping the punishing schedule from doing lasting damage, even as it burned through the boy's remaining reserves of patience and sleep. Between the accelerated training and his continued nightly battles against Nano's simulated opponents, the prince barely recognized himself in the reflection of still water some mornings. Thinner around the face from missed meals, sharper around the eyes from missed sleep, but steadier too, in a way that had nothing to do with how tired he felt and everything to do with how much less afraid he'd become. Rumors of the accelerated examination spread quickly among the rival heirs, and reactions split sharply along predictable lines. The six great clans' favored candidates welcomed the change eagerly, confident their years of formal training gave them every advantage against classmates who hadn't received the same head start. Lesser cadets, the ones without powerful families behind them, grumbled quietly among themselves about a system that seemed designed to keep them exactly where they'd started. One evening, a cadet from a smaller allied house approached the prince cautiously during a break between drills, someone who had watched the fight against the spring air from a safe distance without ever speaking to him directly before. He asked, somewhat awkwardly, whether the prince thought the sudden schedule change targeted him specifically. The prince considered lying, offering some reassuring dismissal to avoid drawing further attention. Instead, he told a version of the truth. He said he suspected it did, and that regardless of the reason behind it, complaining changed nothing. The only real answer available to either of them was to train harder than whoever had pushed for the change expected. The cadet seemed to take some quiet comfort from that answer, nodding before returning to his own drills with slightly straighter posture than before. It was a small moment, easily missed by anyone not paying close attention, but it planted something the prince hadn't fully noticed happening around him until then. Other cadets, ones with no stake in clan politics and nothing to gain from associating with him, had started watching him the way people watch someone worth believing in. That quiet, unearned trust settled strangely in his chest. For years, the only genuine loyalty he'd known came from Guard Jang, purchased through old debts to his mother, and later from the Guardian, earned through a single moment of clever pretending in an infirmary bed. This felt different. These cadets owed him nothing. They simply seemed to be choosing, on their own, to believe he might actually matter. Assassination attempts, meanwhile, grew quieter but no less persistent. A servant assigned briefly to his quarters turned out to be feeding information back to a minor faction aligned loosely with one of the six great clans, reporting his training schedule, his meal times, small details that meant little individually, but painted a useful picture for anyone patient enough to assemble them. Nano flagged the pattern of questions the servant asked other staff members, subtle enough that no one else noticed, but consistent enough to raise real concern once the prince reviewed them carefully. Rather than confronting the servant directly, he chose a quieter countermeasure. He began deliberately feeding false details into his own daily routine, small inconsistencies designed to mislead anyone tracking his movements too closely, a supposed extra training session that never actually happened, a rumor about switching sleeping quarters that turned out to be false. Small lies, carefully placed, meant to waste the effort of anyone trying to map his life from the outside. The Guardian, once he learned of the tactic, looked at his disciple with a new kind of genuine respect. Few grown cultivators bothered developing that kind of patient, layered caution, he said, relying instead on raw strength to bulldoze through every problem. It came more naturally to someone who had spent his entire childhood surviving through wit rather than power. The comment lingered with the prince longer than the Guardian probably intended. He had never thought of his years of quiet survival as a skill worth admiring. He had only ever experienced it as necessity, the exhausting, constant work of staying one step ahead of people who wanted him gone. Hearing someone frame that same exhausting habit as a genuine strength, rather than simply a symptom of how badly his life had gone, shifted something quietly in how he understood himself. Dr. Baek's suspicion, meanwhile, hadn't faded the way the prince hoped it might. During a second routine examination scheduled ahead of the upcoming trial, the physician spent noticeably longer than necessary studying the boy's internal energy readings, comparing them silently against notes from his very first assessment weeks earlier. The numbers had shifted more than any natural cultivation process should have allowed in such a short span. Beck didn't confront him outright. Instead, he asked a careful, almost casual question about whether the prince had received any unusual medicine or treatment recently, phrased gently enough to leave room for an innocent answer. The prince offered the same explanation he'd relied on before, crediting the Guardian's private instruction and his own stubborn persistence. Baek accepted the answer with a slow nod that didn't quite match the thoughtful look still lingering in his eyes. Later that night, lying awake long after his simulated training session had ended, the prince found himself thinking about how many people around him were slowly, quietly beginning to notice that something about his progress didn't add up. Guard Jang suspected exhaustion hid something deeper. The Guardian suspected a natural gift that had simply never been given room to grow before. Beck suspected medical intervention of some kind. None of them had guessed the real truth, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as he possibly could. Nano, sensing the direction of his thoughts, offered an unprompted observation. Secrecy, it noted, carried its own kind of cost. Every lie required maintenance. Every explanation needed to remain consistent across dozens of separate conversations with people who talked to each other more than he sometimes remembered. Eventually, contradictions would surface, whether from carelessness or simple bad luck. The prince acknowledged the warning without much comfort attached to it. He understood the risk already. He simply had no better option available yet. Revealing Nano's existence, even to people he trusted, invited a danger far greater than any accumulated suspicion currently posed. Better to manage small cracks quietly than risk shattering the entire foundation his survival depended on. As the days counted down toward the second examination, tension across the academy climbed steadily. Sparring matches grew rougher during official training hours, as cadets tested each other ahead of the formal rankings to come. Alliances solidified along clan lines more visibly than before, while a smaller, looser group of unaffiliated cadets, including the one who had approached him earlier, began quietly gravitating toward the prince without any formal announcement of loyalty. The spring heir, humiliated weeks earlier in front of the entire training yard, watched these developments with barely concealed resentment. Word reached the prince, through his cautiously reinstated informant, that the spring heir had begun training privately with unusual intensity, determined to reclaim his reputation during the upcoming rankings. Whether that determination would translate into another direct confrontation or simply fuel a stronger performance in ranked combat remained an open question neither Nano nor careful observation could yet answer. 3 days before the examination's official start, the Guardian called the prince aside for what he described as a final piece of guidance before the trial began. He didn't offer any new technique that evening. Instead, he spoke plainly about what the coming days would actually cost. Winning decisively would draw exactly the kind of attention the prince had spent months trying to avoid, sharpening the 6 great clans' focus rather than easing it. Losing, even narrowly, would hand his enemies proof that his recent progress had limits after all, encouragement enough to escalate whatever quieter schemes they'd been patiently developing since the infirmary assassination attempt failed. There was, the Guardian admitted honestly, no clean outcome available to him, only degrees of danger and the responsibility of choosing which kind he was willing to face. The prince absorbed that warning in silence, turning it over carefully, before finally answering. He said he would rather be dangerous and watched closely than harmless and eventually killed anyway, the way his enemies had always intended for him, since before he was old enough to understand why. The Guardian studied him for a long moment afterward, something unreadable passing behind his usually amused expression, then nodded once and said nothing further. That night, alone in the quiet dark of the barracks, the prince summoned Nano's simulation one final time before the examination began. Not the spring heir this time, but a composite opponent Nano constructed from fragments of every ranked cadet whose fighting style it had managed to observe or analyze across the preceding weeks. A preview, however imperfect, of what waited for him in the days ahead. He lost the first exchange badly. The composite opponent came at him differently than anything Nano had generated before, borrowing the spring heir's aggressive footwork one moment, then shifting without warning into the more disciplined, patient guard of a stronger cadet whose style Nano had only briefly observed from a distance. It refused to settle into a single predictable rhythm the way earlier simulations had. He reset and tried again. The second attempt ended almost as quickly, the composite opponent exploiting a hesitation in his stance that no single real cadet had ever managed to find before. Nano noted quietly that combining multiple fighting styles produced unpredictable openings the prince hadn't yet learned to anticipate, since no real opponent existed who fought exactly this way. That, he realized grimly, was precisely the point. The second examination wouldn't pit him against one known style he could study and dismantle. It would throw him against an unfamiliar rotation of opponents across several rounds, each one bringing habits and instincts he'd never fully cataloged. He kept fighting anyway, loss after loss stacking up through the night. Some defeats came fast, ended before he'd properly settled into a rhythm. Others stretched longer, forcing genuine adjustments partway through the exchange rather than clean, repeatable patterns. Slowly, a different kind of instinct began forming underneath the frustration. Not memorized counters to specific techniques, but a broader, more flexible sense of timing, that could bend to whatever came at him next. Somewhere past his 20th defeat that night, he stopped trying to predict exactly what the composite opponent would do and started simply reacting to what was actually happening in front of him, moment by moment, without forcing it into a shape he expected. The shift felt uncomfortable at first, less controlled than the careful, deliberate style Nano had originally built for him. But slowly, uncomfortably, it started working better than deliberate planning ever had. By the time gray light began creeping through the barracks window, he had strung together 3 consecutive near wins against the composite simulation, each one collapsing at the final exchange, but each one lasting noticeably longer than the one before it. Nano offered no reassurance about whether that improvement would hold up against real opponents in a few hours. It simply logged the data and left the conclusion to him. Exhausted, sweat-soaked despite none of the fighting having been physically real, the prince allowed himself a few minutes of stillness before the academy's morning bell would summon every cadet toward the examination grounds. He thought briefly of his mother, of Guard Zhang's steady presence through years when nobody else bothered to care whether he lived or died, of the Guardian's blunt, wine-soaked honesty that had somehow become the closest thing to genuine mentorship he'd ever received. He thought of Dr. Bake's careful, searching eyes, and of a small circle of unaffiliated cadets who had quietly decided, without being asked, that he was worth standing beside. Not one of them knew what truly lived inside him. Not one of them understood that the boy they had decided to trust carried something pulled from a world they couldn't begin to imagine. Something that had turned a discarded, powerless 7th son into someone capable of standing where he now stood. The gap between what they saw and what was actually true remained as wide as ever, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as his survival required. The morning bell rang across the academy grounds, sharp and unmistakable, summoning every cadet toward the examination arena. He rose, splashed cold water across his face from the basin beside his bed, and allowed Nano one final quiet check across his body, confirming that the exhaustion from an entire night without real sleep hadn't left anything dangerously compromised beneath the surface. Everything came back within acceptable limits, though barely. Outside, the training grounds had transformed overnight. Wooden stands now surrounded a wide circular arena at the academy's center, filled already with instructors, elders, and a scattering of curious nobles who had traveled specifically to witness the academy's second examination firsthand. Banners bearing the crests of the 6 great clans hung prominently around the arena's edges, a not-so-subtle reminder of exactly whose interests this trial ultimately served. Cadets gathered in ordered rows near the arena's entrance, sorted according to a ranking system based on their performance during the first examination and their subsequent training reports. His name appeared lower on the initial bracket than his recent progress deserved, a small, deliberate insult buried inside an otherwise procedural document. He recognized the hand of clan influence behind it immediately, though proving such a thing would accomplish nothing beyond wasted effort. The spring heir stood several rows ahead, back straight, expression carefully composed into something colder and more controlled than the wounded arrogance he'd worn during their first confrontation. Whatever private training he'd undergone since that humiliating defeat, it showed in the deliberate stillness of his posture now, patient in a way that suggested genuine improvement rather than simple bravado. An elder stepped forward at the arena's center, raising both hands until the assembled crowd quieted. He announced the examination structure in a clear, carrying voice. Cadets would face opponents drawn randomly from across the entire entering class, advancing through successive rounds until only a handful remained standing by the day's end. Victories would be recorded permanently. Losses would be recorded just as permanently, following each cadet through every remaining year inside the academy's walls. The first pairings appeared on a raised board beside the arena, names arranged in careful brackets that would determine the day's opening matches. Whispers rippled through the assembled cadets as they searched for their own names, calculating instantly who they'd been paired against and what that pairing might mean for their chances. The prince searched the board methodically, working through the tangle of names until he found his own, positioned against an opponent he didn't immediately recognize, a cadet from a mid-tier clan he'd had little direct interaction with since arriving. Whatever fighting style waited on the other side of that name remained, for now, a complete unknown. Exactly the kind of unpredictable challenge his exhausting night of simulated defeats had tried to prepare him for. Nano, quiet until now, offered a single observation as the crowd's noise swelled around him. It noted, without any particular emotion attached to the words, that everything learned across the previous night's simulations would now be tested against something no simulation could ever fully replicate. Real stakes, real consequences, an opponent who wanted, genuinely and completely, to win. The Elder's voice rang out again, calling the first pair of names toward the arena floor. It wasn't his match yet, but watching the two chosen cadets step forward into the open circle, weapons drawn, the crowd's noise rising with anticipation, the prince felt something tighten in his chest that no amount of nighttime practice against imaginary opponents had fully prepared him for. Whatever happened next, inside that arena, would shape everything that followed. The 6 great clans were watching. The Guardian was watching, Dr. Bake, Guard Jang, and a small circle of loyal cadets who had thrown their trust behind him for reasons even they probably couldn't fully explain, were all watching too. And somewhere behind all of it, unseen and unproven, Nano continued its silent work, the one true advantage nobody around him had ever managed to uncover. His name would be called soon,